If this massive instability and trade war continues to be fought in the way it is being fought by America, in a really completely irrational, unpredictable, unstable way, in a way that I don't think has ever before happened in trade policy, and certainly not in the modern era. In this situation, it's almost inevitable that there's going to be damage to the world economy because it affects investment decisions, markets, financial markets, and so forth. And unfortunately, what is the famous story? I think it's East Asian line: when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and so do the ants. Well, obviously, India is hardly an ant, but some of the other countries really are. And it's going to be very difficult to avoid the damage if it gets serious enough. People can now see that this transformation of America is fundamental. This movement is there. The policy making and the attitudes it shows are there, and we've seen it in these last 2 or 3 months. And anyone must reasonably assume this can continue, will continue, and that the old America is gone. At least for the indefinite future. We can't unsee what we have seen and unexperience what we've experienced. And what we experience is a chaos in policy making of a kind that I don't think any great power has ever shown before.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Trump's tariffs, Chinese retaliation, and the impact on the rest of the world were by far the biggest story last week. So today we assess the situation that's emerged. Did the United States President blink and retreat? Where do US-China trade relations stand? Is there a danger of a future confrontation between the United States and Europe? And what will be the impact of all of this on the international global environment? Joining me from London is one of the world's most highly regarded voices on the economy, the Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times, Martin Wolf. Mr. Wolf, did Trump blink and retreat? What a commentator in your paper, The Financial Times, calls clear-cut capitulation? Or is this part of a well-thought-out negotiating strategy and a coherent plan to isolate China, as Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, has claimed? In your eyes, which of the two is it?
I find it very difficult to believe this is part of a well-considered strategy. If he wanted just to isolate China and focus on China, he could have done so from the beginning. But in fact, he's introduced all sorts of deviations from that. What is the purpose of that? It doesn't help him in any way in dealing with China. It just irritates everyone else in the world, which he's done to a quite extraordinary degree. So the actions against Canada and Mexico, the actions on steel and autos, all the rest of it doesn't really have anything to do with China. Then he introduced the reciprocal tariffs, so-called reciprocal tariffs, on absolutely everybody in the world at wildly varying rates from 10% on upwards. Then China retaliates. Then he gets a market meltdown, and he starts he says, well, all this is postponed for 90 days, except, of course, for China because it's retaliated. And then he changes the rules on electronics tariffs for China. So I think it's just complete chaos. That's clear. He doesn't have a plan. But it is clear that, and it has always been clear, it's been clear since he first emerged in politics, that China is a particular bête noire of him and, of course, of the entire American right, because it's seen as a genuine peer rival and a threat.
Let me ask you, Mr. Wolf, why do you believe Trump blinked? Is it because Japan and possibly China, according to some accounts, was selling treasury bonds, which created panic in the financial market? Is it because, as the Washington Post suggests, that Republican senators, both on Fox television and in private conversations in the Oval Office, were beginning to express their concern? Or, as Politico magazine suggests, that fear of a possible recession could affect political support and damage Republican prospects was beginning to worry President Trump himself? Which do you believe is the best explanation?
Well, first of all, I have given up long ago trying to explain or rationalize what Trump decides to do. It seems to me completely impossible. He's obviously a man of impulse. He has many impulses. He doesn't process information and make decisions in what I am most sort of normal people would consider a rational way. But my guess would be that all of the above were relevant to him, and that in addition, the financial meltdown, which occurred last week, particularly in the bond markets, was seen by people in his administration and possibly even by himself as really quite dangerous for a government that has to sell a vast quantity of bonds. I mean, it runs huge deficits, it has to roll over huge debt. That's pretty frightening. So if you add all these things together, he could say, well, I'm retreating in order later to advance. And he's always been, as it were, tactically amazingly flexible, I would say strategically too. And this is an example. I think all three could well have been a factor, could well have been factors, but I don't think we know which is the decisive one.
But in a nutshell, regardless of what spin he puts on what he's done, this is a retreat, this is a backing down.
Yes, I mean, well, I can't believe that introducing these so-called reciprocal tariffs on what he called pompously Liberation Day, followed by a retreat a couple of days later in their application to pretty well everybody, but admittedly with a so-called 90 days pause while everybody negotiates with him, which he might feel is a bit of an achievement, though the ability to negotiate different agreements with nearly 200 countries in 90 days can't be done. So he might at least say to himself, well, I've got something out of this. People will negotiate with me. They're all worried about me. And I think it's an important thing to my mind that what Trump, I think, is really motivated by is being the center of attention, being the man whom everybody has to respond to. And he doesn't really mind if there's chaos. In fact, I think he enjoys it if he caused the chaos. So in that very big way, well, he hasn't had a success. It's not backing down. It's just more of the same. It's more of the show.
Tell me, I'll come to China in a moment's time, but I want to pick up on that thought that you made in the middle of that answer that negotiating 200 deals in 90 days simply can't be done. So, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, do you believe that the threat of reciprocal tariffs will revive in 90 days' time? That this is a sword of Damocles that's simply been lifted a little higher, but it will descend because he will not have succeeded in negotiating 200 and more deals in 90 days?
I think that's a very, very good question. My instinct, and it's pure guess, I mean, predicting Donald Trump is just about impossible, is that they won't return. The countries that have sort of shown suitable obeisance by saying they're willing to negotiate, if they're not really important, will be left alone. And some other countries that he wants to make an example of won't be. So it will be selective again. He likes that. There are some big fish in that huge pond, particularly the European Union. He might well want to go back to the higher tariffs on the European Union, while ignoring Lesotho, say, or Cambodia. It's, I think, just impossible to predict. And that is the most important factor in this whole story. The unpredictability of US policy makes decision making for anybody in business, in finance, just about impossible. But I don't know what he's going to do next. And I have a pretty shrewd guess, I think, that he doesn't know yet.
So, as far as the rest of the world is concerned, the unpredictability of Trump's behavior continues. And because unpredictability continues, uncertainty continues. And therefore, the danger and the risks are there as much as they were a week ago?
My view is nothing fundamentally has changed in terms of business decision making and uncertainty, except possibly you could conclude from the last week that the President of the United States isn't actually willing to take the world economy over a cliff. So there is a limit somewhere, but where exactly that limit is and how far short of that limit he will go, we don't know.
Let's then, at this point, Mr. Wolf, come to the US-China situation. As you said, first he imposed 145% tariffs on China, and then China in return imposed 125% tariffs on America. But late on Friday night, Trump exempted some 20 product categories from tariffs, and they include major exports from China, such as iPhones, computers, laptops, hard drives. As far as China is concerned, is this a second round of backing down by Trump?
I think they will probably feel it's a bit of backing down, but my own guess is it probably shouldn't be seen as backing down vis-a-vis China, but that something else is going on here, which is very important. The industries that were affected by those tariffs include some enormously powerful companies. The most obvious is Apple. Apple makes all its iPhones abroad and many of them in China. With those tariffs, the iPhone suddenly became prohibitively expensive in the United States, which will make many, many, many millions of people very unhappy who want to buy new iPhones. And Apple is very, very powerful. And there are no doubt other important electronics manufacturers who make all their product abroad because they don't make electronics in the United States. They don't make computers in the United States. Companies like Dell and so forth. And they will have screamed at Mr. Trump. And they matter. These are very big and powerful businesses. He doesn't want them to become out and out opponents. So I think, they may have offered him something. I have no idea what, but for these reasons, he exempted them. Of course, in the process, he made a real mess of the tariff policy, because what he's done is make, with the tariffs plus this, he's made producing these products in America completely impossible, because the tariff on the final product is vastly below the tariffs to nowadays on the intermediate inputs. And so nobody is going to assemble at all in the United States, which goes against the whole aim of his reindustrialization policy. Maybe more like this will follow, because the electronics are very important, but there are other industries that matter. So what we may be seeing is, in addition to the pressure from China, but the pressure from domestic economic interests, who are, of course, very powerful.
If you set aside for a moment the 20 odd product categories that were exempted on Friday night, who, in your opinion, loses more from the US-China clash? The BBC the other day said that for every 5 goods that China sells to the United States, the US only sells 1 to China. Does that suggest that China has more to lose? Or is the real loser the American consumer, who depends upon China for a range of products, from microwaves to washing machines to shoes and even toys?
I think both are true. In terms of disruption to the industrial sector, this is going to affect China more than America. But in terms of a disruption to consumption, it's clearly going to affect America immensely much more than China, because, as you rightly pointed out, American consumers purchase a huge quantity of goods from China and from countries that use Chinese inputs, like Vietnam, who may also be attacked, though at the moment they're out of this net, but that is unlikely, it seems to me, to last. Furthermore, the Chinese can, if they want, I've been arguing this for 20 years, easily compensate for this lost output by expanding domestic demand. Domestic consumption is extremely low in China. It's well within their ability to expand it. In fact, they should have done it long ago, and they can make up for the loss of output sold to America, which is, relative to their GDP, as opposed to their manufacturing, not that large. America, on the other hand, can't produce these things that they're going to lose at home for a very long time. It takes an enormous amount of investment, not encouraged by these constantly changing tariffs, to build up the capacity to produce them in America, and they'll be more expensive. So the American losses are, I think, relatively permanent compared to the Chinese losses. They have less adjustment capacity. And of course, beyond all this, America has undermined confidence in America across the world. And this is going to shift policy all over the world.
Now, we don't know whether Trump will impose more tariffs on China, although he has indicated that later today, Monday, he will be announcing some sort of special levy or tariff on those 20 items that he on Friday exempted, although it may not come into play till a month's time or 2 months' time. If he does any of that, China has said it won't retaliate by increasing tariffs, but it has left open the possibility of other forms of retaliation. What do you think those other forms of retaliation could be, and how worrying might they be?
Well, I would have assumed, though I'm sure the Chinese, who are extremely skilled at this sort of thing, have thought of other possibilities. The most obvious one is financial disruption, namely selling US bonds. The China remains a very major creditor. It's been a creditor for a long time, and it would lose money in the process. But particularly if it encouraged others to follow suit, I don't know whether they would. Probably not. But the most obvious sanctions are financial. The Chinese can also exclude all US service companies, financial services, other businesses which have an interest in China. Not huge, but still they're there. There's still an interest in this huge market. We can exclude all those and very clearly discriminate in favor of businesses from Europe or Japan or Korea or Australia, whatever. So it has instruments there as well, just on the economic sphere. And of course, it's also a military competition with the United States, and it can become more threatening. And everybody sort of knows what that might mean.
Tell me, if China were to start slowly but steadily selling US Treasury bonds, and perhaps in accompaniment, if China were to start also selling some of the US equity it holds, and I'm told that altogether China holds something like 1.6 trillion US equity, of which some 700 to 750 billion is US Treasury bonds. What would that do to the dollar? Would it begin to shake the world's confidence in the dollar as a reserve currency?
My guess is, with the numbers you're talking about, provided confidence in the United States is otherwise robust in the rest of the world, with other creditor nations, the oil exporters and so forth, Europeans and all the rest of it, it wouldn't be really that devastating. And of course, but it is possible that this Chinese pressure of this kind, combined with the increasing uncertainty about the stability, predictability, rationality of American policy across the board, because a lot of other things have happened, as you know, and we still have this Damocles sword, as you put it, of the reintroduction of reciprocal tariffs over our head, that others will start selling or recommence selling in that context, including possibly even Americans, that they will say, well, if the rest of the world doesn't trust our government, are we right to do so? And then things get really difficult. I think that's why that was that concern that made them back down last week more than anything else. I'm sure it frightened the Treasury Secretary, and that can, of course, be restarted. But I don't think China on its own is strong enough to break the dollar or the Treasury market, but it can possibly start a panic.
Is there a danger that when Chinese exports to America sharply reduce, which they're likely to do, that China might start dumping its manufactured goods on other countries? Or do you accept what the Chinese Prime Minister said, that China will seek instead to stimulate consumption within China?
I'm sure it's going to do the latter. It's obvious it has to do so. And far, should have done it long ago. This is quite obvious. But China, I'm not sure, completely controls all these exports. Most of the Chinese exporters are private firms, not the state enterprises. And there are a very large number of them. Unless they close the border or order them not to export at all, which would probably mean the death of countless firms, which we've never heard, but which produce all these products, they're bound to seek alternative markets. They're profit-seeking businesses, and if they've lost a primary market, they will look for other markets. I wouldn't call it dumping. It's a bit unfair in a way, given that the whole story started with America. But it will mean that they will be looking for opportunities elsewhere. And as long as they can earn above marginal costs, short-term marginal costs, not even covering the cost of capital, it's completely rational for a business to sell at a long-run loss, because this allows it to keep going. And I expect a lot of businesses to do so, and they will cut prices again, quite rationally to do so. We can call it dumping, but it's what a rational business will do when it loses a huge market and its marginal costs are very low.
Now, let's turn at this point to Europe. Ursula von der Leyen has told your paper, The Financial Times, that if the European Union and America cannot come to an agreement, she is prepared to expand the trade war to cover services and also impose levies on US digital companies. In your eyes, is that just a threat, or are you worried it could happen? And if it does, what would the outcome be?
I'm not sure of anything in this situation, but I think it's highly likely that this is not just a threat. The US has a large deficit in goods with Europe, but it has a large surplus, in particular with the Eurozone, a large surplus in services. It has a very large services overall. It has services surplus overall. It's the superpower of, as it were, of services as China is of manufacturers. And this is an obvious vulnerability. And similarly, the digital companies earn a lot of money in Europe. It must be far and away their second biggest market. In Europe is weaker because they can't really replace the services provided by the great American tech companies. There are no domestic competitors. But more broadly, yes, they can attack American services, and I would be very surprised if they were to do so, because the overwhelming feeling, not of everybody, but remember, trade policy is by qualified majority in Europe. They don't have to get unanimity in all these areas. So I think that they could act on their own, because the Europeans are fed up of being pushed around by America, which under Trump is a hostile country.
The problem, Mr. Wolf, is that with the potential for the situation to deteriorate so markedly, so sharply, and perhaps so quickly, you end up with a situation where some of the biggest economies in the world, the US, China, and the European Union taken as one, will end up in a trade war between themselves. That will clearly have an international economic impact that is adverse. What does that mean for smaller countries like India or smaller economies like India?
It's going to be a very unstable environment. I think India should be able to survive this. It has, fortunately, rather good relations with both Europe and America. And actually, the trade relations with China don't seem to be too bad, though I would know less about that than you do. But the situation is this: if this massive instability and trade war continues to be fought in the way it is being fought by America, in a really completely irrational, unpredictable, unstable way, in a way that I don't think has ever before happened in trade policy, and certainly not in the modern era. In this situation, it's almost inevitable that there's going to be damage to the world economy, because it affects investment decisions, markets, financial markets, and so forth. And unfortunately, what is the famous story? I think it's East Asian line: when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and so do the ants. Well, obviously, India is hardly an ant, but some of the other countries really are. And it's going to be very difficult to avoid the damage if it gets serious enough.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar.
Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Before I end, let me raise one more issue with you. Stephen Mirren, the chairman of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors, has written an essay recently where he argues that the revenue America will obtain from reciprocal tariffs is payback for what he calls twin global public goods that America provides the world. And he's talking about the dollar as a reserve currency and the US military guarantee. Do you accept that logic?
No, I don't. The Americans have done very well out of the dollar as a reserve currency. It's given them huge leverage on the world. And of course, it has substantially expanded the American financial sector, which is a very important source of American power and wealth. So the Americans have unambiguously benefited from what used to be called and could still be called the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. And if you look at American behavior recently, for the world as a whole, the security guarantee is really not at all obvious. For Europe, it is obvious. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for the Americans to say that the Europeans can and should pay more for their own defense and security. And the Europeans have sort of understand that. In East Asia, it's arguable because it is a balancing force for China. But the principal beneficiaries, the Japanese and the Koreans, have clearly paid for it with their willingness to lend money very cheaply to America. So again, part of the dollar privilege side. So the idea that there is some huge unrequited burden that the Americans are bearing isn't very plausible. Ultimately, America has done all this because it believed it was in its interests. And if you look at America's position in the world over the last 60, 70 years, its continuing primacy, it's rather difficult to argue it wasn't in America's interest. Now, admittedly, along comes an administration that thinks we don't want to do any of that. Well, the US is entitled to make that decision, and the rest of the world is entitled to respond to the way America makes that decision.
In this connection, some people are speculating that the time has come for a second Plaza Accord, which would persuade leading exporters to the United States to agree to a depreciation of the dollar. And that might ease some of President Trump's concerns about the trade deficit he faces. How do you respond to that suggestion?
Well, I don't think this is a really complicated issue. It's much more like what happened in early 1971 with the Nixon shock than the Plaza Accord, which is a temporary adjustment of exchange rates it really was a policy that lasted a year or two, then was offset by the Louvre Accord, which just happened a few years later to stabilize exchange rates. So, and the peak of the dollar in 1985, was ridiculously high. So everybody understood that adjustment was necessary. That's not the case now. It's much more like when Nixon decided the dollar had to be devalued after the inflationary pressure created by the Vietnam War and so forth. The question, however, in these situations is what policies underlie or underpin this adjustment of exchange rates. If America is asking everyone in the rest in the world to raise interest rates and it basically impose recessions on the rest of their economy to get their exchange rates up, it probably won't work and they're not going to do it. the Americans can, of course, depreciate their currency quite easily simply by lowering interest rates. The best way of doing that in the long run is to tighten their fiscal position, but they're not prepared to do that. The tariffs won't be enough to tighten their fiscal position appreciably. It doesn't really need an international agreement to get this to happen, in my view, except possibly with China. And they could discuss that in the context of a grand bargain with China. We will see whether that anything like that can happen. But it's really about China. It's not about any other part of the world.
Finally, after all that's happened, can we go back to the previous status quo, or is that now virtually impossible?
Well, as long as Donald Trump is president or anybody in his movement is president, the answer very clearly is no. They have shown both attitudes to foreign countries and to economic management and to trade policy, which are so out of the ordinary that nobody can assume normality will return. That's impossible. If it becomes obvious that the MAGA movement itself is defeated and gone, the Republican Party becomes something like the old Republican Party, which I don't believe will happen, then people might, after a long time, start saying, well, we're back to a more normal America, or what we thought of as a normal America. But we did hope precisely what you suggest when Joe Biden won in 2020. Many hoped around the world that that was the return of a normal America. But Biden got defeated, and not well, he got thrown out, and Harris got defeated. The Democrats got defeated, and the result of that is very clearly that people can now see that this transformation of America is fundamental. This movement is there. The policy making and the attitudes it shows are there, and we've seen it in these last 2 or 3 months. And anyone must reasonably assume this can continue, will continue, and that the old America is gone, at least for the indefinite future. We can't unsee what we have seen and unexperience what we've experienced. And what we experience is a chaos in policy making of a kind that I don't think any great power has ever shown before.
Mr. Wolf, thank you very much for the time you've given me. I'm deeply grateful. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.